Wow, I got some new light bulbs in my sewing room and they are bright. Just remembered I forgot to put my microphone on the camera. Hold, please. Okay, there we go. So today I'm going to talk about picking fabrics for quilts. I'm so glad you're here. This is a topic I think some people, just noticed a spider web. Some people, focus, Nikki. Okay. Some people have trouble with is choosing fabrics. I've gotten some questions about this over time, and so I thought I would just give you some quick tips for choosing quilting fabrics. And so I'm Nikki, this is Precuts, so let's hop right into it. I think people struggle with this mostly because they just don't trust themselves to know what looks good. And they think that if they think it looks good, that's not quite enough. It needs to be like industry standard good or something like that. So I'm hoping to dispel some myths for you and also give you some practical ideas and tips for gathering together fabrics for a quilt. So we can't talk about choosing fabrics for quilts without talking about pre-cuts. That means the little like pre-cut collections of fabrics they sell, usually designer fabrics. They'll come out and you can buy like a whole set of fat quarters or strips, what do they call it, jelly rolls, or like layer cake, I think is the big squares, or the charm packs, which are like 5-inch squares. And these are great. These are not my preferred MO. I am too free-spirited for pre-cuts, I think. Not that I have never bought them, because I think I have a couple of times. And sometimes they're either a good deal, or one time I needed some solids in my stash. This is funny though. I bought a pre-cut pack of fat quarter solids in just colors that I generally liked, and then I ended up putting them all in one quilt. And so then I had no solids left. That kind of backfired on me because then I still didn't have solids in my stash, which is the reason I bought them. Anyway, if you want to buy pre-cuts, these might be for you if you're starting from scratch, like you're kind of a beginner and you don't really have a stash built up already, or if you really just have no idea where to start and the reason you're not starting a quilt is because you don't have the mental capacity to pick out the fabrics. So pre-cuts can be a great jumping off point. I personally like to add a lot more flavor into my quilts, so I cannot stick to a pack of pre-cuts. I think they usually end up looking very put together and traditional, and that is just not my personal aesthetic, as you might know. So my tip though for growing yourself is that if you buy pre-cut fabrics, try to also add in some of your own tastes into that collection of fabrics to make it look different, to make something pop, or to just practice getting good at seeing what you like with other things. So if you buy a pre-cut set, try to add some more things into it from your stash, or pull it apart and try to mix it up with lots of other fabrics for various projects instead of just sticking with the one package of pre-cuts that already all match for your quilt. Also, pre-cuts are pretty expensive. Designer fabrics in general, if you're buying them, are going to cost kind of a lot. So these pre-cuts can be pricey. So to get around that, what I recommend instead of buying a whole pre-cut pack is to choose 1 or 2 of your favorite prints from a fabric collection and then take them home, see what you already have to match with them or to go with them. We don't try to match, we just try to go. And then you can sort of build your own thing. You'll end up with something more unique and you'll get practice at putting fabrics together. Okay, so when I'm about to start on a quilt, this is what I usually do. I pick out one great print that I want to work with, and then I will choose like a color out of that print and try to choose something else in my stash that goes with it. I'm pretty particular about colors. I want it to be the same. It's hard to explain. But if the pink in my print is like a muted pink, I am not going to put whatever pink I have in there. I'm going to look for the right pink. So while this seems like anything goes, especially with scrap quilting, I actually still am pretty particular about the colors and the shades that I'm choosing. So once I have that main print, I usually pick a fabric to go, and then I pick another fabric to go, and I try to make sure I have a few like subtle prints, a few small prints, and a few maybe solids or low volume prints. That just means like color on color basically. So it gives it some like texture look without being a total solid. And then I'll put like a black and white in there and see how that looks or something like that. So I try to see everything that I have to go with the print I've chosen. This usually takes me a few tries. Sometimes I change the print up altogether. And then after I have done that, I can see the gaps that I have. If I'm working on a quilt and I need something that I'm not finding in my stash, only then do I go out and go shopping for more supplementary fabrics that go. This really helps save money, and that I'm not shopping to stash build without any plans. And it saves me from building too big of a stash that I have no plans for, and that I end up not having a ton of fabrics that are great fabrics, but they don't go with anything else in my drawer. And of course, it just helps my quilt come together kind of naturally. I'm spending money with a purpose. I'm buying fabrics I really need instead of just cramming my drawer with more and more fabrics before I ever have a plan. I hardly ever go fabric shopping just to go fabric shopping. This is true for me and clothing too. You go shopping because you need something, right? Not because you just feel like shopping. Okay, so an example of this, I had Natalie, my daughter Natalie she picked out some fabrics that she wants a quilt with. These have been floating around in my purse, so they're pretty like scraggly now. But she went through my drawer. She really likes these blues and tans. And so I cut up a scrap of the ones that I have on hand, and then I put a safety pin in them and toss them in my purse so that I can go find supplementary fabrics to go with these. Like right now I have several tans, but I don't have very many big pieces. So I can get more of this one, and then I can find the right blues to match the blues I already have. So I like to bring little swatch clips like this with me. I toss this in my bag so that I have it, so that when I come across something that will work, I can get it. Or if I'm going shopping specifically for this, I have the right color to match, because not all blues are created equally, or tans actually. It's kind of harder than you might think. So another example of this is when I was working on my house quilt. I was working in a but a broadly specific color palette. It was kind of pastel-y, and I really noticed that I needed more low volume prints to go around the trees and the houses. And so I was able to go onto Etsy and I bought a scrap bag of just low volume prints, and that ended up carrying me through the entire quilt. It was just what I needed. And then again with my fish quilt that I'm working on right now behind me, I needed more blue and watery fabrics, and so I went online and to my fabric store and I just bought a few things that matched the palette that I was going through, this really saturated, rich colors of blues. Okay, let's move on to talking about scrappy quilts. I have heard this quote that says, to make a scrap quilt, actually use scraps. That's how to make it look like a scrap quilt. I have noticed on Instagram especially that a lot, like the word scrap quilt mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. I've noticed that the people who buy a lot of designer fabrics will pull out those fabrics and call it a scrap quilt, even though they're using like large pieces of like cuts of fabric, like they have yardage. To me, a scrap quilt would be like literally your scraps, like these. So, I mean, whatever it means to you, I think the scrappy look, we can all agree, just looks like fabrics that maybe didn't come together. Or if you think of quilts from ye olden days, they were just piecing together scraps from clothing they had, things like that. So the most truly scrappy quilt I've made is probably the one, let me just go get it and I'll show you. Okay, it's this one. I absolutely love this quilt. It's one of my very favorites. It's very cozy. And I really was just pulling out strips that were big enough and pieces that I could cut 2 to 3 of these 2 by 3 inch rectangles out of. And I love how this turned out. I think some mistakes people make with scrap quilting is thinking they have to use scraps that they don't necessarily like. And I am of the very strong opinion you should not put fabrics you don't like into your quilt. That might be controversial because some people say if you don't like a fabric, you just haven't cut it small enough. And in some cases that can be true, yeah. But I think the reason people do that is because they think it's wasteful to not use the scraps that you have. But you can get around this. Here's how. Use those scraps as stuffing, donate those scraps, put together a bunch of scraps you don't like and take them to a quilting group or donate them to Goodwill because somebody will like them. I have firsthand knowledge of this because one time I did a video on ordering scrap grab bags off Etsy and other places, and one of them was this what I thought was a garishly ugly like Halloween print. And you will not believe how many commenters said, I love that print, I will buy it from you. I had already donated it. So somebody will love it. It's not going to go to waste if you decide to pass it along. I'm not saying throw it in the trash, but pass it along to someone else because you don't want to put fabric that you think is ugly into your quilt, because it will bother you every time you see it. Promise, it will. Okay, so my method of scrappy quilting is a little bit more formulaic than just like blindly grabbing scraps out of your drawer. My scrappy quilts, I don't think anyone would argue that my house quilt is not a scrappy quilt. It's definitely made with small pieces. It's not matchy-matchy. It's all over the place. But it does have a color palette. It is sort of a muted pastel palette. And there's nothing like neon or bright or overly saturated in there. It has an overall, I guess I would call it a mood. And so when you're putting scrap fabrics together, you can stick to an overall mood. Like this fish quilt, the overall mood is very saturated. So that's kind of the opposite of my fish quilt. And another tip for scrap quilting, if it's just looking too crazy and all over the place, is choose a color to leave out of your palette. I think this goes for home decor too, and I think I've talked about it before, but my home is decorated in pretty much every color except purple. There's no purple. And there is pops of other colors like yellow, but my palette is encompassing all the colors except those few. I think if you choose one or two colors to leave out, then the whole thing can look a little bit more cohesive. But if you like the look of just grabbing scraps and putting anything together with anything, and that brings you joy, do it. I do still think though that it's important to assess how fabrics look next to the other fabrics. I think scrap quilting isn't really just a free-for-all. I think if you look at this quilt, I was still making sure that there was contrast in the rows and that nothing looked garishly, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? Garishly oppositional? I don't know. With the fabrics next to it. I was still being pretty careful about choosing what was next to what. Okay, let's move on to the idea of a themed quilt. This is a mistake I have seen people make. Say you want to make, your nephew wants a dinosaur quilt. And so some people will go out and find every dinosaur print that they can and make it into a quilt. I think that a better method is to choose one great dinosaur print that you really love and then find other fabrics to go with it. From your stash, with the method that I described earlier, choose other fabrics that match so that you don't have this weird free-for-all of colors all over the place and too much visual stimulation. You need to have like a mix of small prints, big prints. So if you have your big dinosaur, maybe you find something with little dinosaur bones on it, or you find a brown textured fabric that looks like dirt. You just don't need to be so literal about things. When I was shopping for the blue fabrics for my fish quilt that I needed, I went to my local fabric store. They asked me what I was making. I showed them a little picture of my fish. And she said, "Oh, did you see the ocean fabrics that we have?" And I did see the ocean fabrics, but they just did not vibe with the colors I was trying to work with. It would have been way too literal. It would have drawn the eye too much to those wave ocean prints, and it just wasn't what I was going for. But somehow, even though I'm not using literal wave prints, you can still tell that I'm going for fish in water, right? So don't be quite so literal, and don't go all out on your theme. It's just like if you're decorating a room with a theme. Do you guys remember that show Trading Spaces? And sometimes they would, like this poor kid, I even feel like they did it on, what was that, Extreme Makeover Home Edition. A kid would be like, "Oh, I love dinosaurs." And so they would go all out on this crazy dinosaur theme, and the family's like, "Whoa, I didn't mean quite so far, you know?" So remember that next time you're making a themed quilt. Okay, lastly, I think it's important to trust yourself. I have known some people, I have taught a friend to quilt who just did not trust her design sense or color sense enough. And I think internally she thought there were rules that she needed to follow. Listen, if you like it, make it. And if your recipient likes it, that's all that matters. If you're making a quilt for someone else, use what they like, or let them choose fabrics and don't argue with them about what rules it doesn't follow. I think that in this influencer culture, lately I've been getting a lot of reels on Instagram by fashion influencers. I don't follow any fashion influencers because this drives me so crazy, so I don't know why I always get these reels in my feed, but they'll be saying like, "These boots are outdated. You need to replace your fall boots so that you don't look frumpy this fall." And then of course they list a bunch of pairs of boots that cost $400. But you know what? I still like the boots that I had last winter. And I actually still like the jeans that I always have looked good in. And the styles currently don't look that great on me. So why would I go out and replace it? If I like it, I like it. So if you are making a quilt and you like how the colors look, trust yourself, go with it, and just make it. And on the flip side, if you're not liking it, take that fabric out of there. It is worth getting your seam ripper out and taking that one ugly fabric out. I promise you, I have made this mistake. I've just carried on with a quilt, and I always hated that one little piece of fabric in there, and it will always drive me crazy. So that's my advice for you. I hope this has been helpful. If you have tips for choosing quilt fabrics, or if you agree or disagree with anything I've said, please tell us in the comments, because I think this conversation could be really helpful, and it might spark some ideas and inspiration for the rest of us. So if you like this video, go ahead and like it with the little thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss future tutorials. I have a lot coming down the pike. We never decided. We'll see y'all soon. Bye.